All right, our next guest has a hard out at 3 o'clock, so I'm going to skip the long story I would have told about him, which is probably good. Karen Greenberg runs the Center for National Security at the Fordham School of Law. I couldn't think of anybody better to be asking the questions today. Matt Olsen, who is the Assistant Attorney General for National Security for the United States of America, which means everything that Lisa Monaco talked about today, he's the guy who's actually getting it done in DOJ. So Matt Olsen and Karen Greenberg.
They look like they're on, right? So, Matt, it's so nice to see you again.
Yeah, Karen and I go way back.
Yeah, we go way back, and I know you've already been introduced, but just a little by way of introduction, that your career has really spanned the growth of the national security apparatus, of the evolution of our institutions, and particularly NSD at DOJ. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about, you know, when Commissioner Bratton talked about opening the doors of communication, and you've been at the center of law enforcement and intelligence as the core of national security and counterterrorism, et cetera. Talk a little bit about that evolution.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think like a lot of folks, including many of the people who've been here to speak, and first of all, thanks to you, Karen, for doing this, and thanks to the Soufan Center and Ali. This is a great event, and I really am pleased to be here. Look, I did not leave law school thinking I was going to work in the national security field. There was no such thing as national security law when I graduated from law school. I was a federal prosecutor in D.C. doing homicide cases, and then, but again, like so many of the folks that you're hearing from and people in this room, you know, 9/11 changed all that for me. I was working in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I had a chance after 9/11 to go to the FBI and work with this guy named Bob Mueller, who at the time was obviously the director of the FBI, and be part of the transformation, at least supporting the effort at the FBI to transform post 9/11 into a national security and counterterrorism organization. And from that, I did a number of other, I was in a number of other roles, including at the Justice Department, at the beginning of the National Security Division, which was started in 2006. And then I moved out to the intelligence community, to NSA, and I was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. I'm back at Justice now, which is sort of my professional home. But really, I think the key point is, you know, again, like so many folks, 9/11 was a real pivot for me professionally, and I've stayed in the counterterrorism business really for the past 20 years.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what has changed, though, over those 20 years in terms of the threats, and not just the threats, the tools that are available to counter those threats, and how much what's used against one threat works against another threat. So let's talk about international terrorism, jihadist terrorism, and what we're facing. You know, Chris Wray, not so long ago, said that, you know, the lights were flashing red, and that we really did have to think about the United States, the homeland, being targeted again by groups like ISIS and maybe Al-Qaeda. In terms of the evolution of NSD and of national security concerns, is this something that had been minimized within the department, and then all of a sudden there's a new concern about it, or is it just sort of the same constant that we've been looking at since 9/11? How does that?
Well, I would say two things. One, one thing is different. The threat landscape has changed dramatically from a terrorism perspective. That's very different. One thing is constant, and that is the relentless focus on protecting the homeland. And that is true today as true as it was 20 years ago. You know, every day I'm with the Attorney General and the FBI Director, and Bobby Wells, who I know is here as well. So the leadership of the FBI and talking about the threats we're facing and getting the intelligence information, and the absolute relentless focus is on what's happening inside the United States, who's here, who's trying to get here, and who is, you know, seeking to carry out particularly terrorist attacks, but other threats as well. But that is exactly the way it was, you know, when I was with Director Mueller in 2004. That has not changed. Obviously, the threat landscape has changed dramatically. We are not in the same place we were 20 years ago when it comes to international terrorism. It's a much more fragmented and diverse set of threats that we face. You know, certainly, and I know folks have talked about this, but the the challenge of inspired individuals, lone actors inside the United States. That's the kind of threat that we're seeing when it comes to sort of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. In fact, and folks may have been tracking, it was just a few days ago that there was an individual who was arrested in Canada based on a charge out of the United States, out of New York, for trying to come here in the name of ISIS to carry out, again, allegedly, to carry out a terrorist attack in New York City, targeting the Jewish community. And so that threat, I think, is the sort of primary one we're most concerned about. You ask, like, what we're doing. I do think that's also an example of how well we're working together. Like, we're working really seamlessly across the intelligence community, getting that information, as well as the law enforcement apparatus of the FBI, taking steps with the prosecutors to bring charges, and working really closely with our partners in Canada to effect an arrest. Like, that's a story, I think, that is a really positive outcome of the focus and investment that we've made over the past 20 years.
So is there an uptick in the transnational threat coming into the United States and acting on behalf of a terrorist organization? Is there an uptick on that?
I mean, I think the FBI director talked about being concerned about, the types of attacks we've seen from, for example, from ISIS-K in Russia and Iran, and the potential for an attack like that here certainly has been a real focus of ours.
Yeah, so let's turn a little bit more to the homeland, because we've done a lot of talking about the international realm today, and really talk about this notion of leaderless a leaderless terrorism, ideologically diverse terrorism that seems to link up with one another. There sort of be like a wide spectrum that is posing the same kind of threat that may or may not come together, that may or may not coalesce. How is that changing or not changing the mechanisms, the strategies, the understanding of how to deter and prevent the threats that that suggests?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to think about it is there's multiple levels or multiple vectors of terrorism threats that we face today. We just talked about sort of the international terrorism, the inspired or potentially directed threats coming from ISIS-K and foreign terrorist organizations. Certainly that remains a challenge. But that's, at another level, very concerned about state-sponsored threats, terrorism. And obviously that, when you talk about state-sponsored terrorism, it's Iran. Is the primary concern, and we've seen Iran be increasingly active inside the United States. And then the third vector is domestic terrorism. Individuals in the United States motivated by domestic ideological views and looking to carry out attacks again inside the United States. And the challenge, I think, is that's all happening at once. So, and you mentioned sort of multi-ideological perspectives or motivations. Like, sometimes we see people who have mixed, some a domestic ideology perhaps with an international one, right? And so it's kind of it's hard to decipher a clear or coherent ideology. What I will say is, as you talk about our tactics and our response, it's a really challenging problem because, as many folks have said, the biggest problem is lone actors or small cells, right? And so we're talking about often individuals who are often radicalized online. They are communicating through encrypted means of communicating, so we have limited access to their communications. They have easy access to military-grade weapons, and they are increasingly choosing soft targets, restaurants, places of worship, grocery stores. So you put those things together, and it creates, you can see why that's such a challenging problem for law enforcement to stop a terrorist attack under those conditions.
Yeah, and the youth factor. I mean, what we've noticed is that, it's been getting that way for a while, since the beginning of ISIS and the threat in this country, but it's getting younger and younger and younger. So that's more of a challenge as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing and shocking to see the ages of individuals who are, motivated by to carry out attacks, whether it's ISIS or on the domestic terrorism side. And look, the fact is, and I think, for good reasons, we have limited law enforcement options for a 14-year-old, a juvenile. They're not going to face the same kind of criminal justice system as an adult, again, for good reason, but it gives us, our disruption options can be limited under those circumstances.
So is there some kind of notion of community outreach, of dealing with parents? Are there new programs developing to sort of inform people ahead of time about what the warning signs are and how to constructively prevent this?
Yeah, absolutely. And the FBI is at the forefront of handling that set of problems, for sure.
One of the things I want to talk to within this context is the threat to our elections. And the way in which, we now see, we sort of hear the word threat. You turn on the television almost every day, and it's whether it's ballot fraud, whether it's threat to poll workers, whether it's disinformation, whether it's foreign malign influence, interference. And the DOJ has a role in this. It has a role in addressing this. Can you talk about some of the different tactics that DOJ has developed and is now implementing in terms of just making the country safer and reducing the threat level for elections?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about a lot of different threats in this room, and obviously we're very concerned about terrorism and remain so. But the thing that's keeping me up at night these days is foreign election interference and foreign malign influence in our elections. We're 60 days away from our elections. Our leaders, whether it's the DNI or the FBI director, have raised the alarm. And I think right now it's very fair to say, based on what we're seeing and what they're saying, that the threat from foreign actors to influence and interfere with our elections is a clear and present danger to the United States. The intelligence community has done a great job, I think, really learning the lessons from 2016 to be more transparent about the nature of those threats, and that is an important way to help inoculate our electorate and create some resilience among voters to understand what is often happening is the efforts of Russia, Iran, and China to provide disinformation and propaganda in order to shape our elections. For our part at the Justice Department, we bring cases. We bring prosecutions and take enforcement actions. And that's last week we announced 2 significant cases involving Russian interference. One identifying 2 defendants allegedly working for Russia Today, or RT, who had spent $10 million to support a company in Tennessee that was an arm of RT and an arm of the Kremlin, putting out disinformation about the United States. The other action was a seizure of 32 internet domains that at the very highest levels of the Kremlin, the presidential administration was using to spread Russian disinformation and propaganda. They spoofed Washington Post, Fox News, looks like actual Washington Post website, but it's all Russian propaganda, all designed to shape the election, to support a particular candidate, and to really undermine support for our efforts in Ukraine is one of their main goals. But really, fundamentally, it's an attack on our democracy, and it's designed to weaken the United States, weaken other countries in the West who are democratic and support authoritarian goals, whether that's Russia, but we also see that to some degree from Iran as well as China.
Which brings up another element of the evolving national security environment, which is the public-private partnerships and how that functions. Because these are crimes, alleged crimes that are being committed within private agencies. And also, so the intelligence sharing has to become not just between law enforcement and the intelligence community, good old days, but with the private sector. Just talk about that a little bit.
I think it's a really important insight, Karen. We didn't even prep that question, but that's a really good one. Because look, I think when you think about terrorism and counterterrorism, we're talking about making sure that we're sharing information between law enforcement and the intelligence community. The intelligence community is sharing information with other, intelligence services, and it's really we've made a lot of progress, right, in the last 20 years. The challenge when it comes to the kinds of threats we face today, foreign election interference or foreign malign influence. Enforcing export controls, cybersecurity. These are not just government solutions, right? These are not challenges that government can solve alone. They, by definition, involve the private sector, and we have to be in a position where the private sector is our partners. And that's true in the foreign influence space. We have to be able to talk to social media companies that are often the unwitting purveyors of this information. So the FBI has to be able to go and say, we've seen this. We've seen Russia trying to do this on your platform. You should enforce your terms of service. When it comes to stopping the flow of sensitive technologies, like we're stopping the flow of microelectronics to support Russia's military to make missiles and drones that they're using to kill civilians in Ukraine, we have to be able to go and talk to those companies. Those companies they're trying to do the right thing, but we can go and tell them, hey, beware of these other companies, beware of these transshipment points, know your customer. So, that challenge, that information sharing challenge when it comes to the public and private sector is, it's not new, but it remains a paramount, I think, challenge for us. And I think it's imperative that we do that to address all of those threats.
Yeah, and one place where it's really important, and we did prep this one, is on in the larger realm of cybersecurity, which of course intersects with what we've been talking about all along. But I think when people hear the word cybersecurity, they think hacking, they think sort of like very technical kinds of things. But cybersecurity, the actual definition of it has changed so much over time, and a lot of that's landed in the basket of the various professions that, posts that you've occupied over this time. So my real question is, in the cyber threat, what other places within government have to be brought in? I know you talked about the FBI, Homeland Security, ODNI. Has it enlarged the players that you have to sort of coordinate with and talk to for it's so many threats that are within the cybersecurity, from voter suppression to malign influence. They're also related, things like that.
Right.
So,
I would say from the Justice Department perspective, when we think about cybersecurity and the cyber threat, I think the observation is that cyber is just a vector of choice for foreign adversaries when it comes to a whole range of threats: foreign malign influence, transnational repression, certainly putting our critical infrastructure at risk, even, of course, traditional espionage, just stealing our secrets. So cyber is a vector. So we actually, a year ago, started a new section, a new part of the Justice Department in the National Security Division, devoted just to nation-state cyber threats. So it's not about, ransomware is a huge problem, criminal groups, that's a huge problem. And we have a lot of great prosecutors in the Justice Department focused on that. What I wanted to do is have a group of prosecutors and analysts focused on nation-state cyber threats, and having that group of prosecutors not only prosecute threats after they happen, but be forward-leaning, so on our front feet, so that we can stop the kinds of threats that we're seeing. So being proactive and disrupting, for example, bringing in cases against PRC actors who had set up a botnet where they were able to take over routers of homes and small businesses and use that access point to put our critical infrastructure at risk. And we used traditional tools like search warrant tools and the like to actually eliminate that threat, to take that malware out of those routers. So it's using sort of some old school tools, but being proactive to eliminate that threat, or at least mitigate it significantly. And then more traditionally, just last week we announced a case against GRU, Russian military intelligence, who had the Whispergate campaign was a very concerted cyber security campaign or cyber campaign targeting Ukraine, other places, but really targeting Ukraine as a run-up, as really the first shot in their invasion of Ukraine.
You're going to keep me up at night now thinking about all this back. But then I was thinking, so in terms of just how you have to vet something like that and plan it, it sounds to me like this is also the State Department has to be brought in, and the diplomatic corps, depending on where they are. And so I assume that's always been the case in terms of foreign, engagements, foreign suspicions. But is it more so now in terms of having to really play that part out and make sure that you're doing something that won't be disruptive in a way? So what I'm trying to say is, hasn't the conversation continues to expand in terms of who has to be brought into it and how that's functioning?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's a lesson from 9/11 and our counterterrorism fight that we apply in other contexts. So certainly, when we are doing terrorism cases, we're working closely with the State Department, with the intelligence community, and with our partners overseas. We just apply that same basic playbook when it comes to these other threats, and it's always important that we work these issues, with our partners in the government, and often, they're coordinated through. We time these actions to ensure that we're not interfering with other things that are happening in the government. At the same time, we're the Justice Department. We're independent. We make decisions, when we have the facts and the law to support those decisions, and we bring cases based on that.
Yeah, and earlier today they were talking about court cases and the justice system and how it really is, so much more can be needed, particularly in the context of hostilities or almost hostilities or incipient hostilities. But I think the real point here is that it's 23 years since 9/11, right, yesterday, and to really look at how the national security enterprise has developed and how the idea is it's going to just always be developing. And so that must be on your mind all the time too, like this new office. There's always something new that's coming down, or at least that's what it looks like from the outside. Is that sort of the expectation? Not,
Yeah, I mean, and absolutely, and it's probably right to think about that the day after the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. That we're obviously always trying to be as agile and as possible and to evolve based on the threats we face. It's why we started a national security cyber section. It's why we now have a domestic terrorism unit within our division, within the national security division, because the rise of the threat of domestic terrorism in the United States just warrants that level of effort. But look, fundamentally, the lesson is, are we learning all the lessons that we need to learn? Are we sharing information? Are we acting as good partners? Are we bringing all tools to bear? I would say this, because you've been around this space for a while, Karen. There was a time when counterterrorism was viewed as either a military activity or a law enforcement activity, right? And there was a false dichotomy 20 years ago that had been created around this. And I think that's a lesson that we've learned quite well, that we're going to bring whatever tool works, whether it's an arrest or a military action overseas. We're going to take whatever action we need to take to protect the American people, and that same lesson and all of those lessons from 9/11 apply with equal force across the range of threats that we've talked about.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Matt Olsen, for joining us for this talk, and it's always an extreme pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Karen. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.